They handed her cousins a 4,000-acre cattle ranch worth $80 million. They handed her a key to a barn and a $10 bill she had to give back. Wren Halloway was 18 years old the morning she walked out of the state group home in Great Falls, Montana, carrying one cardboard box that held everything she owned in this world. 3 changes of clothes, a library copy of a book she'd forgotten to return, a photograph of a mother who'd been dead since Wren was 2 years old. The social worker called it freedom. It felt more like being thrown off a cliff. Then the phone call came. A lawyer named Merritt Kavanaugh, with a voice like dry pine needles, told her that the grandfather she'd never been allowed to meet had died 3 months earlier. He'd left her one thing in his will: a collapsing cedar barn on 2 acres of land in a valley called Cedar Hollow, 4 hours south. The price was $10. She had 30 days to claim it. Her Aunt Celeste, who inherited everything else, offered her $30,000 to walk away, to sign the barn over and never come back. Wren said no. She didn't know yet that the barn held the last letter of a man the Forest Service still called a legend. She didn't know it would cost her almost everything she had left, but by the end she would understand exactly why her grandfather had given her $10 and a key. The morning Wren Halloway turned 18, the sky over Great Falls was the color of wet ash, and the wind coming down off the Rockies smelled like winter, even though April was already 3 weeks old. She woke at 5:30 without an alarm. She had been waking at 5:30 for 2 years and 3 months. The state group home on 6th Avenue North ran on a schedule as rigid as a prison, and her body had learned to anticipate the rising bell before it ever rang. She lay in the narrow bed for a long minute, listening to the radiator tick and the breathing of the 3 other girls in the room. And she thought about how this was the last morning she would ever spend in this building. The thought did not feel like joy. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark. She rose without sound. She had already packed. Everything she owned in the world fit into one cardboard box that had once held printer paper and now held 3 pairs of jeans, 4 shirts, a winter coat from the donation bin, a paperback novel she had borrowed from the public library and never returned because she'd been moved to a new placement before she finished it, and a photograph in a small wooden frame. The photograph showed a woman with dark hair and gray-blue eyes standing in a field of yellow grass with a baby on her hip. The baby was Wren. The woman was her mother, Iris Halloway, and she had been dead since Wren was 2 years old. That was the entire weight of an 18-year life. One box, she could carry it under one arm. The social worker, a tired woman named Joyce with gray roots showing under copper-dyed hair, met her in the front office at 7. There was a manila envelope on the counter. Inside was a state-issued check for $250, a printed list of local shelters, a bus pass good for 30 days, and a single sheet of paper that said in formal language that Alora Wren Halloway was now and forever beyond the jurisdiction and responsibility of the Department of Family Services for the state of Montana. Joyce signed the bottom of the page with a pen that was running out of ink. She slid the envelope across the counter. "Happy birthday, honey," she said. The words sounded like a recording she had played 1,000 times before. "The world's waiting." Wren did not answer. She picked up the envelope. She picked up her box. She walked out the front door and down 3 concrete steps onto a sidewalk that did not belong to anyone she knew. The world was waiting.
It was waiting the way an empty highway waits, the way an empty room waits, the way a long winter waits for someone to walk out into it. She stood there for a long moment with her box under her arm. The wind pushed her hair across her face. She was 18 years old. She had $250 to her name. She did not know where she was going to sleep that night. She started walking toward the bus station.
She had walked 3 blocks when the phone in her jacket pocket began to buzz. It was a cheap prepaid phone she had bought with her last paycheck from the diner where she had washed dishes on weekends. The number on the screen had a Missoula area code. She did not recognize it. In her life, unknown numbers had almost always been bad news, and the small handful of times they had been good news had been small. Good news indeed. She almost let it go to voicemail. Something stopped her. Some thread she could not have named pulling at her ribs. She answered. "Is this Alora Wren Halloway?" The voice on the other end was a man's voice, older, dry as pine needles in late August. He pronounced her full name carefully, the way a man reads from a document. "It's Wren," she said. "Nobody calls me Alora. My name is Merritt Kavanaugh. I'm an attorney out of Missoula. I was the executor of your grandfather's estate." She stopped walking. She stood very still on the sidewalk while a delivery truck rumbled past her and a woman pushed a stroller around her on the inside of the curb. "My grandfather," she said. "Silas Halloway. He passed away in late January. I have been trying for 3 months to locate you. The system is not always efficient about these things, Miss Halloway. I am very sorry for the delay." Silas Halloway. The name was less a memory than a rumor. A man she had seen exactly twice in her life at family events. She could only barely remember before her mother died, and her father broke, and the door closed forever between the small, frightened child she had been and the cold, towering world her grandfather had lived in. A wealthy man. A famous man, supposedly, though she had never understood what for. A man who had let her vanish into the foster system without ever once reaching out across the long silence of 16 years. "He passed," she repeated. The words tasted strange. 3 months ago. The reading of the will took place last month. Your cousin Celeste and her husband attended, and a small, bitter laugh almost escaped her throat. Celeste. The aunt she had not seen since she was 3 years old. She could picture them in her mind. Celeste in tailored black, dry-eyed, and patient. Garrett Thorne beside her, the developer husband she had read about once in a newspaper article. They would have sat in the lawyer's office collecting their inheritance the way other people collect dry cleaning. "I don't expect anything," she said. The words came out flat. She meant them. There was a long pause on the line, a rustle of papers. "That is not entirely accurate, Miss Halloway. Your grandfather made a provision for you. It is unconventional." She found that she was holding her breath. She forced herself to let it out. "Unconventional how?" "Your cousin Celeste and her husband inherited the substantial portion of the estate. The Halloway Ridge Ranch, 4,000 acres of cattle country in the Whitefish Valley. The investment portfolios, the mineral rights, the primary residence." He paused. She could hear him breathing. "For you, your grandfather left one asset, a piece of property in a town called Cedar Hollow, approximately 4 hours south of where you are now. The deed describes it as 1 cedar barn and 2 surrounding acres of land." A flicker of something stirred in her chest. Not hope exactly. Something colder. Something more careful. "A barn," she said. "Yes. Just the barn." "Just the barn. There is a condition. Per the terms of the will, the property is to be sold to you for the sum of $10. You have 30 days from your 18th birthday to claim it and complete the transaction. If you do not, the property reverts to the main estate and is absorbed by your aunt's holdings." She stood on the sidewalk and watched a sparrow land on a power line and tilt its head at her. A barn, not a house. A barn that she had to buy. Her wealthy, distant grandfather, the man who could have given her something real, had left her a falling-down farm building for the price of a cheap lunch. It was an insult dressed up in legal paper. A final message, posthumous and clear, that she was and always would be the outsider, the charity case, the granddaughter the family had thrown away. She felt something hot move behind her eyes, and she would not let it become anything she could see. "Why?" she said. The word came out harder than she meant it to. "I think that is a question better answered in person, Miss Halloway. I am in Great Falls today. I can meet you within the hour. There is something else your grandfather left for you, a personal item. He instructed me to deliver it only after you signed the deed." She closed her eyes. The wind had risen. It was pushing at her with the cold and patient weight of a winter that was not yet done with the year. She had $250 and a cardboard box. "Where?" she said. He named a coffee shop 4 blocks from the bus station. She walked. He was already there when she arrived, sitting alone in a corner booth, with a leather briefcase on the seat beside him. He was older than his voice had sounded. Late 70s, maybe. Thin white hair combed back from a high forehead. A gray wool suit that had been good 20 years ago and was still good now worn the way a man wears a thing he respects. His hands were folded on the table in front of him. They were a working man's hands turned into a thinking man's hands by long, careful use. The knuckles were broad. There was an old burn scar across the back of his right wrist that disappeared into his cuff. He stood when she approached. He looked at the cardboard box she carried. Then he looked at her face. Whatever passed behind his eyes in that moment was not pity. It was something quieter and more difficult. Miss Halloway, thank you for coming. Sit, please. She slid into the booth. He ordered her a hot chocolate without asking her if she wanted one. The waitress brought it in a heavy white mug. Wren wrapped both her cold hands around it and felt the warmth go up through her wrists and into her arms, like the first kindness she had received from a stranger in longer than she could remember. Doc Kavanaugh waited. He did not push her. He sat across from her and watched her drink and did not say a word until she set the mug down. "All right," she said. He opened the briefcase. He took out a manila folder. He set a single document on the table between them, turned so she could read it with a pen laid carefully across the top. "This is the transfer of deed for parcel 7B-44 in Cedar Hollow, Montana. 1 cedar barn, 2 acres. You sign here and here. You pay $10 to the estate. The property is yours." She looked down at the lines. Her hands shook a little and she set them flat on the table to make them stop. "Why did he do this?" she said. "Why a barn? Why $10? Why like this?" Doc Kavanaugh looked at his folded hands for a long moment before he answered. When he spoke, his voice was very low. "I knew Silas Halloway for 46 years. He was the most honorable man I ever met, and he carried a weight I never fully understood until very near the end. He did nothing without reason. He gave you this barn, Miss Halloway, because it was the most important thing he owned. More important than the ranch. More important than the money." She stared at him. "A barn," she said. "A barn." He paused. He looked at her steadily. "There is something else you should know before you sign. Your aunt's husband, Garrett Thorne, contacted my office 2 days ago. He is aware of the terms of the will. He has made you an offer." He took a second sheet of paper from the folder and laid it beside the deed. "He will pay you $30,000 cash if you sign the barn over to him within 72 hours of your 18th birthday. That clock started at midnight last night. You have approximately 68 hours remaining to accept." $30,000. The number sat on the table in front of her like a living thing. It was more money than she had ever seen. It was more money than she had ever imagined seeing. It was an apartment. It was a car. It was a year of community college. It was a deposit on a normal life, the kind of life other girls her age were already living, the kind of life she had begun to believe was something other people got handed. And she was simply not the kind of person things got handed to. All she had to do was give up a barn she had never seen in a town she had never heard of, that her grandfather had clearly known was nothing but trouble. "Why?" she said again. Her voice was very quiet. Why does he want it so much? Doc Kavanaugh was watching her face. He nodded slowly as if she had asked the right question. Mr. Thorne is a developer. He is also, through several shell companies, the principal investor in a project called the Whitefish Valley Copper Initiative. He has been quietly acquiring mineral rights and surface easements across the Upper Valley for the last 6 years. The project is scheduled to break ground this fall. He waited a moment. Your barn sits directly over the primary aquifer that feeds 14 working ranches and the town of Cedar Hollow itself. The geological surveys he has commissioned, which are not public, indicate that the open-pit copper extraction his project requires will discharge arsenic and heavy metal tailings into that aquifer at concentrations that will render the water unsafe for human or livestock consumption for approximately the next 300 years. She stared at him. She could hear her own pulse. Your barn is the only parcel of land on the access route he does not yet control. The previous owner refused to sell. The previous owner was your grandfather. She did not move. She did not breathe. Silas would not sell to him at any price. So Mr. Thorne is now offering $30,000 to an 18-year-old girl with $250 in her pocket. He is gambling that you will be reasonable about it. Doc Kavanaugh's voice had not risen at all. It had only gotten quieter. There was something underneath the quiet that was very hard and very old. Your grandfather, Miss Halloway, did not want you to be reasonable about it. Your grandfather wanted you to understand what you were holding before you decided what to do with it. That is why he left you the barn. That is why he left you only $10 to pay for it. He wanted you to know in your bones that what he gave you cost almost nothing in money and almost everything in courage. She sat for a long time without speaking. Outside the coffee shop window, a man walked past with a small dog on a leash. The dog stopped and lifted its leg against the trunk of a parking meter. The world went on the way. The world goes on, indifferent and uninformed, and inside her chest, something very small and very stubborn was starting to harden into a shape she did not yet have a name for. She picked up the pen. She signed the deed on the first line. She signed it on the second line. She took $10 from her envelope, 2 crumpled 5s that had passed through more hands than she could count, and she pushed them across the table. Doc Kavanaugh folded the money. He placed it in a small envelope. He sealed the envelope. "It is done," he said. "The property is yours." He reached into his briefcase. He took out 2 things and set them on the table in front of her. The first was a heavy iron key, black with age, with a small brass tag stamped with the numbers 7B-44. It was the kind of key a man made by hand a long time ago for a lock he meant to last. The second was a cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax. Her name was written on the front in a spidery, beautiful script she did not recognize, but somehow knew the way a person knows a voice in a dream. "He left this for you," Doc Kavanaugh said. "He instructed me very specifically. You are to read it only after you are inside the barn, not before." He was very clear about that. She picked up the envelope. It was heavier than paper should be. What does it say? I do not know. I never opened it. He sealed it himself the week before he died. She held the key in one hand and the letter in the other, and the weight of them together was greater than the weight of everything else she had carried that morning. What about Thorne's offer? She said. Doc Kavanaugh's old eyes did not waver. You have 68 hours. You can call me at any time, day or night. If you decide to accept the offer, I will draw up the paperwork. If you decide to refuse it, I will help you with what comes next. Either way, the choice is yours, and yours alone. He paused. He looked at her a moment longer. Your grandfather was my friend, Miss Halloway. He was my friend for 46 years, and he never once asked me for a favor. He asked me for one thing only at the very end. He asked me to make sure his letter reached your hands. I have done that. The rest is yours. He stood. He set a small business card on the table with the phone number written by hand on the back. He picked up his briefcase. He nodded once to her, slow and formal, the way an old man of a certain generation acknowledges a thing of weight, and then he walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. She sat alone at the table for a long time with a cooling mug of hot chocolate and a key and a letter and a choice. Then she picked up her box and she walked to the bus station and she bought a ticket to Cedar Hollow. The bus left Great Falls at 11:15 in the morning and ran south through country that grew steadily emptier the farther it went. The interstate gave way to a two-lane highway. The two-lane highway gave way to a county road. The country opened out into long, rolling grass and dark stands of lodgepole pine and the white shoulders of mountains still holding their winter snow against the spring. Wren sat by the window with her cardboard box on the seat beside her, and her face turned to the glass. The other passengers were a thin scattering of ranchers and old women going to visit grandchildren, and one young soldier in fatigues who slept with his mouth open and his head against his rolled-up jacket. Nobody spoke. The driver kept the radio off. The miles passed in a long, quiet hum of tires on pavement. She thought about the $30,000. She thought about it the way a person thinks about a door they could walk through if they only had the courage to admit they wanted to. She thought about a small, clean apartment in Bozeman or Boise, about new boots that fit, about a refrigerator she could fill with food she chose, about a bed that belonged to her and a door she could close behind her, and a life in which no one ever again would tell her to be ready by 7 and lights out by 10. $30,000 was freedom. The barn was a problem. The smart thing, the careful thing, the thing any reasonable person would do, was to take the money. But she kept seeing the burn scar on the back of Doc Kavanaugh's wrist. She kept hearing the way he had said the word honorable. She kept feeling the weight of the iron key in her jacket pocket cold against her ribs through 2 layers of cloth. Her grandfather had not given her a problem. He had given her a question, and he had not lived to hear her answer. The country grew taller. The mountains came closer. The road bent west into the long shadow of the Whitefish Range, and somewhere past 3 in the afternoon, the bus slowed and pulled off into a wide gravel turnout beside a small wooden sign that said, Cedar Hollow Pop 412 in faded white paint. The driver looked at her in the mirror. "This is your stop, miss." She gathered her box. She stepped down into the gravel. The bus door closed behind her with a hydraulic sigh, and the bus pulled away in a slow shudder of diesel. And then she was alone. The silence that settled over her was the silence of a place that had been quiet for 100 years and intended to stay that way for 100 more. Wind moved through the tall pines on either side of the road. A crow called once from somewhere up the ridge. The air smelled of cedar and wood smoke and snow that had not yet finished melting in the high country. Cedar Hollow was a crossroads. There was a general store with a tin roof gone red with rust. There was a post office no larger than a shed. There was a gas station with one pump. There was a small clapboard diner with a hand-painted sign that said "Eat" and a Methodist church at the end of the road with a steeple too tall for the size of its building painted white and standing very straight against the gray sky. A scattering of small houses ran down a side lane and disappeared into trees. That was the town. She stood on the gravel shoulder for a moment, holding her box. The wind pushed her hair across her face. Then she walked across the road to the building with the sign that said, Renfro Hardware and Feed, in old gold lettering on the window. A bell over the door chimed when she went in. The smell hit her first. Cedar shavings and machine oil and dust, and the faint, sweet musk of leather harness oil from a corner display. The store was small and crowded, and so neatly organized that every nail and bolt and length of chain seemed to have a place it had been waiting for its whole life. A wood stove burned at the back. Behind a long counter built of varnished pine sat an old man on a high stool. He was 70 or near it. Heavy through the shoulders even now. Hands the size of small skillets scarred and knuckled and calm. White hair cropped close to his skull. A face that had spent a long time outdoors and made no apologies for it. He wore a flannel shirt under a brown canvas vest and steel-rimmed reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He had a newspaper open in front of him. He looked up when the bell rang. He looked at her over the tops of the glasses. He did not smile. Then his face changed. It changed slowly the way weather changes. The lines around his mouth softened. Something moved in his eyes that she could not read. He sat very still for a long moment, just looking at her. He took off the reading glasses and folded them and set them carefully on the counter. "Sweet, merciful God," he said, quiet almost to himself. She stood in the middle of the floor with her box clutched against her chest, and she did not know what to say. "I'm looking for parcel 7B-44, she said finally. "The old Holloway place. I was told there was a barn." He stood up from the stool. He came around the end of the counter and stopped about 6 feet from her. He was looking at her face the way a man looks at a photograph he has carried in his wallet for 30 years. "You're Iris's girl," he said. "You're Iris Holloway's girl." She nodded once. She could not trust her voice. "What's your name, child?" "Wren." "Wren." He said it slowly. He nodded. "Wren Holloway. Of course it is. My God, you've got her eyes. You've got her exact eyes. I haven't seen those eyes in 20 years. He passed a hand over his mouth. He turned away for a moment, looking at the wood stove. When he turned back, his eyes were wet, and he was not ashamed of it, and that more than anything else was what made her own eyes begin to burn. "My name is Buck Renfro," he said. "I knew your grandfather. I knew him for 50 years. He was the best friend I ever had in this world, and I have been waiting 8 months for you to walk through that door." She set the cardboard box down on the floor very gently. Her hands were trembling. She did not know why. "He told you I was coming. He told me you might come. He said if you did, I was to feed you and answer any question you asked me and give you anything you needed. He also said I was not to tell you anything you did not ask. Those were his instructions, and I am an old man who keeps his word." She looked at him. He looked back at her, steady and patient and unhurried, with the kind of stillness that belonged to men who had spent their lives waiting for things larger than themselves. "Tell me about him," she said. "Tell me who he was." Buck Renfro nodded once slow. "Sit down, Wren Holloway. Sit down by the stove. I'll put on coffee." She sat in a wooden chair beside the wood stove. He moved around the back of the store with the unhurried economy of a man who had been making coffee in this same spot for 50 years. He brought her a tin cup of coffee, black and bitter and very hot. He brought a second cup for himself. He sat down across from her on an overturned nail keg and rested his big hands flat on his knees. "Your grandfather was Silas Holloway," he said. "Born in this valley in 1944. Buried up at the cemetery on the ridge 3 months ago next Tuesday. I dug his grave myself. I would not let another man do it." She held the coffee in both hands and did not move. "He was a smoke jumper," Buck said. "Do you know what that is?" "No." Smoke jumpers are the men the Forest Service drops out of airplanes into the worst forest fires in the country. They parachute into ground no truck can reach. They cut fire lines with hand tools. They sleep on the burn, and they eat cold, and they hold the line until reinforcements can walk in or the fire burns itself out. It is the hardest work this country has, and your grandfather did it for 14 years out of the Missoula base. He took a long swallow of coffee. In the summer of 1967, there was a fire up in the Selway Bitterroot, the Sundance Fire. It blew up in one afternoon to 150,000 acres. A crew of 12 men got cut off on a north slope when the wind turned. They had no way out. The brass at the operations center wrote them off. They told the families to start making arrangements. He paused. He looked into his coffee. Your grandfather was the jump foreman on duty. He took 2 volunteers and a Forest Service pilot named Easton McRae, and against direct orders, they flew into a column of smoke a man could not see through. They jumped onto the only piece of bare rock for 10 miles. They cut a fire break by hand through the night. They held it until the morning wind came up the canyon and pushed the fire back on itself. All 12 of those men walked out alive. Your grandfather walked out with 2nd-degree burns down the whole right side of his body and a piece of shrapnel from a busted chainsaw in his thigh that he carried until the day he died. He looked up at her. President Johnson pinned the Medal for Valor on his chest in the Rose Garden the next spring. He never wore the medal. He kept it in a drawer. He used to say the only men who deserved medals for that fire were the 3 he could not get out of the cab of a pickup truck on a fire road in 1972 when he was 68 years old and slower than he used to be. He never forgave himself for those 3. He carried them for the rest of his life. She found that she had stopped breathing. She set the coffee down on the floor beside her chair because her hands had begun to shake too hard to hold it. He was a good man, Wren. He was a hard man and a quiet man, and he made mistakes I will not speak of because they were his to speak of, and he is not here to speak of them. But he was a good man, the best I knew, and he loved your mother more than he loved his own life. And when she died, something in him went underground and never fully came back to the light. She was crying now. She did not know when she had started. The tears ran down her face without her permission, and she did not lift a hand to stop them. Why didn't he come for me? She said. Buck Renfro looked at her for a long time. His face was very gentle. That is the one question you will have to ask him yourself, child. He left you a letter. I know because I drove him to the post office to mail it to Merritt Kavanaugh on the last day he was strong enough to leave the house. Whatever the answer is, it is in that letter. It is not mine to give. She nodded. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. Where is the barn? He pointed. East on the county road, about a mile. You'll see an old stone wall on your left and a dirt track running back through the pines. The barn is at the end of the track. You cannot miss it. It is the only thing back there. He stood. He went to a shelf behind the counter. He took down a heavy battery-powered flashlight and a small propane lantern and a box of long matches. He set them on the counter. Take these. There is no power out there and no water, and it is going to be dark in 3 hours. Pay me back when you can or don't. It does not matter to me. She stood. She picked up the lantern and the flashlight and the matches. She looked at him. Thank you, Mr. Renfro. Buck. Thank you, Buck. He walked her to the door. He held it open for her. She stepped out into the wind and the smell of cedar and the gray afternoon light. And she had taken 3 steps when he spoke again behind her. "Wren." She turned. He was standing in the doorway of his hardware store, with both hands hanging loose at his sides. His face was the face of a man who had been waiting 50 years to say a thing he could not now find the right words for. "You came," he said. "He gambled on you, and you came. That matters. Whatever else happens, that matters." She did not know how to answer him. She nodded once. She turned, and she walked east on the county road, with her box under one arm, and the lantern in her other hand, and the iron key cold against her ribs through her jacket. The walk was a mile. It felt longer. The road was paved for the first half, and then turned to gravel, and then to packed dirt. The wind in the pines was constant, and made a sound like distant water. She passed an old stone wall on her left hand, laid 100 years ago, and still standing, the stones gone gray with lichen. Past the wall, a narrow track ran back through the trees, half grown over with weeds, the ruts deep and old. She turned onto the track. The pines closed in over her. The light dimmed. She walked for what felt like a long time, her boots crunching on the dry needles and the gravel, and then the track opened into a clearing. The barn stood in the middle of it. She stopped at the edge of the trees. She had been expecting a ruin. She had been expecting collapsed walls and a caved-in roof and the embarrassed wreckage of a building no one had cared about for 100 years. What she saw was nothing like that. The barn was 3 stories tall. It was built of cedar planks gone silver, with age set on a foundation of fieldstone that looked like it had been quarried out of the mountain itself. The roof was rusted standing seam metal, the gables high and sharp, the great loft doors closed and chained. The walls were straight, the lines were true. The whole structure had the patient, unfussed dignity of a thing that had been built by men who meant it to last longer than themselves, and who had not been wrong. It was beautiful. It was old and weathered and entirely beautiful, and standing alone in that clearing under the gray Montana sky, it looked less like an abandoned outbuilding than like a small cathedral that had been built in a forgotten country for a forgotten god. She walked across the clearing, slow. The main doors were 8 feet tall and made of heavy planks bound with iron straps. They were secured by a length of new chain and a heavy brass padlock that was much younger than anything else around it. She took the iron key from her pocket. She slid it into the padlock. It turned smooth as butter oiled and recent. She unwound the chain. She pulled. The left-hand door swung inward with a low, protesting groan, and a slice of cold darkness opened in front of her like a mouth. She lit the lantern. She lifted it. She stepped through the door. The smell hit her first. It was not the smell she had been expecting. It was not mildew and rat droppings and the sweet rot of long abandonment. It was the smell of cold air and old hay and clean wood and a faint thread of something that might have been pipe tobacco a long time ago. She lifted the lantern higher. The inside of the barn was vast. The ceiling soared 3 stories up into a complex web of hand-hewn beams that disappeared into the dark above. The floor was packed earth swept clean. To her left, a row of empty horse stalls ran the length of the wall, their wooden doors hanging straight on oiled hinges. To her right, a collection of farm implements stood under heavy canvas tarps, neatly tied at the corners. Everything was orderly. Everything had been cared for. This was not an abandoned building. She walked deeper inside the lantern held out before her, the light moving across the wood like water. Her boots made small sounds on the packed earth. Against the far wall, there was a workbench. The workbench was clean. The tools above it hung on pegs in their proper places. A chisel, a hand plane, a coping saw, 3 sizes of hammer, a brace and bit. The wood of the bench was worn smooth in 2 places where a man's hands had rested for years. Beside the workbench was a small iron cot. It was a military cot, the kind a man carries when he expects to sleep in places that do not have beds. It was made up. A gray wool blanket pulled tight the corners, folded square, an old pillow at the head in a faded cotton case. On the floor beside the cot was a pair of well-used boots set side by side, the laces tucked inside, as if a man had taken them off and lined them up the night before and meant to put them back on in the morning. On a small wooden crate that served as a nightstand was a kerosene lamp. The lamp had oil in it. The wick was trimmed. Next to the lamp was a Bible. She set her own lantern down on the workbench. She walked slowly to the cot and knelt beside the wooden crate. The Bible was old, black leather worn soft. The gold lettering on the spine almost gone. It was open. A red ribbon marker lay across the page. She turned her head and read. The book was open to the 13th chapter of Proverbs. The marker rested across verse 22. A good man leaveth an inheritance to his children's children. She read the verse 3 times. Her hand went to her mouth. He had lived here. Her grandfather had lived here in this barn, on this cot, with this Bible open to this verse. He had lived here in the last months of his life, when he could have lived anywhere in the 4,000-acre ranch, up the valley, in the great house his money had bought, with servants and a soft bed, and a wife who hated him, and a daughter who never came home. He had walked away from all of it. He had come down to this barn alone. He had slept on this cot. He had read this verse. He had been here. He had been here as recently as January. She stood up slowly. She could feel the weight of the letter in her jacket pocket, heavy as a stone. She moved to the workbench. She set the lantern down. She took the cream-colored envelope from her jacket. The red wax seal had her grandfather's mark pressed into it, an old man's initials cut into a signet SH. She broke the seal with her thumb. The letter inside was 4 pages written in the same spidery, elegant hand as her name on the front. She held the first page up to the lantern light, and she began to read. My dearest Alora, if you are reading this, then I am dead, and you have come to this barn, and I have won a long bet I made with God a long time ago. I bet him that you were strong enough to come. He did not have to take that bet. He took it anyway. I think he knew the answer before I did. I owe you everything. I owe you the years I did not give you. I owe you a grandfather, and a name, and a home, and 100 Sunday dinners I never cooked you, and 100 birthdays I never came to, and the long, quiet conversation of a man and his blood that we will never now have on this side of the grave. I cannot give you any of that. It is gone, and I am the man who let it go, and you should know before you read another word that the fault is mine, and I have never tried to put it down. I did not abandon you, Rin. I want you to know that first. Whatever it has felt like for 16 years, I did not abandon you. I was protecting you. I was protecting you from my own family. And I was protecting you very, very badly. And the only reason I am writing this letter at all is that you are 18 years old now, and the protection I gave you is about to fail, and you need to know what is coming for you. Your mother did not die of an illness. I know what they told you. I know what was on the death certificate. I know what your father believed until the day he disappeared into the bottle that finally took him 11 years ago in a single-room hotel in Spokane I paid for and could not save him from. The official record says Iris Halloway died of a brain aneurysm on the night of November 14th, 2010. The official record is a lie. I have lived with that lie for 16 years, and I am too close to the end now to carry it any further. Your mother was murdered. She was killed by people who worked for the man who married my daughter Celeste. His name is Garrett Thorne. He is your aunt's husband. He has been the wolf inside our family for 23 years, and I let him in. I let him in because I was old and tired, and I wanted to believe my daughter had found a good man. And by the time I understood what he was, it was too late to put him out. Your mother found something out about him. She found out about a piece of land he had bought through a shell company up in the high country. She found out what he intended to do with it. She came to me with what she had found, and she told me she was going to take it to the United States Attorney's Office in Helena the following Monday. And I told her to be careful, and she laughed at me and said she had been careful her whole life, and being careful had not protected anyone she loved. That was a Friday. She was dead on Sunday night. They made it look like an accident, a car off the road on the Going to the Sun highway in early snow. Single vehicle. No witnesses. Your father was driving behind her in a separate car. He saw the brake lights. He saw her swerve. He saw a second set of headlights that came up beside her and did not slow down. He told me about those second headlights one time late at night in 2011, the only time he ever spoke of it. He never spoke of it again. He could not live with what he had seen and could not prove. He drank himself to death over the next 4 years, and I watched him do it, and I could not save him either. Garrett Thorne killed your mother. I cannot prove it in a courtroom, and I never could. But I knew it the day she died, and I have known it every day since. And the night your mother died, 2 hours after the sheriff called me, Garrett Thorne came to my house. He sat in my kitchen, and he drank my whiskey, and he told me without saying it directly that if I ever moved against him, or if I ever drew my granddaughter into the family, he would kill you the same way he killed your mother. He looked me in the face, and he said the words quiet enough that no microphone could have caught them, and I believed every word. That is why I let the state take you, Ren. I let them take you because I could not protect you inside this family. The only place I could put you that he could not reach was inside the foster care system, where you would be one anonymous child among 10,000 with no last name that mattered and no money that anyone would chase. I let you go to keep you alive. I have watched you from a distance for 16 years, and I am out of time, and I am out of cowardice. The barn you are sitting in is the last clean ground I own in this world. Everything else has been touched. Everything else is poison. What you do next is going to be the hardest thing you have ever done, and I am not there to help you do it. And the only thing I can give you is the truth and the key and the chance to choose. There is more. There is more in this barn that I need you to find. But it is late where I am writing this, and my hand is tired. And I want to tell you one thing before I sleep. I loved your mother more than I have ever loved anything in this world. And from the day you were born in the front room of a rented house in Whitefish in the second week of April 2008, I have loved you exactly the same. Whatever you choose, child, know that. Your grandfather, Silas. She was sitting on the floor of the barn. She did not remember sitting down. The pages of the letter were trembling in her hand. Her face was wet. The lantern on the workbench above her cast a small circle of light around her, and beyond that circle, the great cold dark of the barn pressed in on every side. Her mother had been murdered. Her mother had been murdered, and the man who had ordered it was sitting in a 4,000-acre ranch up the valley right now, and he was about to poison the water of 14 families, and he had offered her $30,000 to sign her name on a piece of paper and walk away. She could not breathe. She put her head down on her knees, and she sat there in the lantern light, and she could not breathe. Outside the barn, very far away, she heard the sound of an engine. She lifted her head. It was a vehicle coming up the dirt track from the county road. Big, slow, the low growl of a diesel pickup, the kind of engine that took its time and did not need to hurry. She got to her feet. She moved fast. She blew out the lantern on the workbench. The barn went black except for the thin gray light that came through the cracks in the cedar walls. The engine grew louder. Headlights swung across the clearing outside and threw moving bars of pale light through the cracks of the barn wall, sliding across her face and across the cot and across the open Bible on the wooden crate. The truck stopped. The engine shut off. A door opened. A door closed. Boots on gravel. A man's footsteps unhurried coming across the clearing toward the barn doors. The footsteps stopped just outside. A voice spoke soft and pleasant and almost warm. The voice of a man used to being listened to. The voice of a man who had never once in his life been told no. "Wren," the voice said. "Wren, honey, I'm your Uncle Garrett. I just want to talk." She stood in the dark of the barn with her grandfather's letter clutched against her chest, and she did not move, and she did not breathe. And outside in the gathering dusk, the man who had murdered her mother began to push open the door. The door opened 6 inches and stopped. Wren stood in the dark of the barn with her grandfather's letter pressed against her chest, and she watched the line of gray light widen across the packed earth floor. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The lantern on the workbench was cold. The cot was a low shape against the wall. The Bible on the wooden crate was a darker square inside the dark, and the open page caught a thin sliver of failing daylight that crept in through the gap. She did not move. The door opened another foot. A shape filled the gap. A man's silhouette against the gray of the clearing beyond. He was tall. He held his hat in his hand. He was not in a hurry. "Wren," he said again. His voice was the voice of a friendly uncle at a Christmas dinner. "I saw the chain was off. I figured you'd come down. I just want to talk a few minutes. Is that all right with you, honey?" She breathed once slow through her nose. She put the letter inside her jacket and zipped the jacket to her throat. She made herself walk toward the door, because if she did not walk toward it, he would walk through it, and she did not want this man inside her barn. She stepped out into the failing light of the clearing. Garrett Thorne stood 3 steps back from the door with his hat held politely against the chest of an expensive wool coat. He was tall and lean in the way of men who play tennis 4 mornings a week, silver at the temples, a face that had been handsome once and was now the careful arrangement of a man who knew his own jawline well in a mirror. His smile was an instrument. It went up at the corners exactly the right amount and not 1 degree more. His truck idled behind him in the clearing, a dark gray crew cab with chrome polished even on the door handles. The cab was empty. He had come alone. "There she is," he said softly. He looked her up and down once. The look was so brief and so professional, she almost missed it. "My God, you look just like your mother." "You knew my mother." "I knew Iris. I was at her wedding to your father. We danced at her wedding. She was a wonderful woman, Wren." He took 1 step toward her. She did not step back. Something in her face stopped him where he was, and she watched him register it, and she watched the small recalibration move through his eyes and out again. "I'm sorry to come up on you in the dark like this," he said. "I wanted to introduce myself before things got complicated. May I have 5 minutes?" Out here is fine, honey. Out here is perfect." He set his hat back on his head. He gestured toward the open tailgate of his truck. There was a wool blanket folded on it, and a thermos and 2 enamel cups. He had planned this. He had planned this all the way down to the thermos. "Coffee," he said. "It's a cold evening. I thought you might want some. I am not going to ask you to come anywhere with me. I am going to stand right here in the open, and we are going to have a cup of coffee and a conversation, and then I am going to get in my truck and drive back to town and leave you to think it over. That's all." She did not move toward the truck. She watched him pour the coffee from the thermos into one of the enamel cups and hold it out to her at arm's length. The steam rose into the cold air. He did not pour a second cup for himself. She noticed that. She noticed it the way her grandfather in the letter folded against her chest had noticed second headlights on a mountain road 16 years ago. She took the cup. She did not drink from it. She held it in both hands and let the warmth go into her fingers. "Your aunt is sorry she could not be here," he said. "She is at our home in Whitefish tonight. She has had a difficult 3 months, Wren. Your grandfather's passing was very hard on her. She and Silas had a complicated relationship in his final years." "I'm sure they did." "Sure." "She would very much like to meet you. She would like you to come up to the ranch this weekend. We could have dinner. We could talk about the family. There is a great deal you do not know about your mother that we could share with you if you wanted that." "I'm sure there is." He smiled gently at her tone. He took it without flinching. He was a man who had been told no in many small ways across many small years, and had learned not to show that he heard it. "I want to be very straight with you, honey, because I think you deserve straight. You are 18 years old. You walked out of state custody yesterday morning with nothing in your pocket. Today, You inherited a barn that is going to cost you money to keep standing and is sitting on land that candidly has no agricultural value left in it. You are smart enough to know all of that already. She drank none of the coffee. She held it.
I have made you an offer of $30,000, he said. I want to revise that offer in person since I have the chance. I am going to offer you $50,000 cash today by certified check, plus a 2-bedroom condominium I own in Bozeman that I will deed to you free and clear. The condo is fully furnished. It is 2 blocks from the campus of Montana State. It is yours, Wren. You sign the barn over to me tomorrow morning in Merritt Kavanaugh's office. And by tomorrow afternoon, you have $50,000 in a checking account, and a place to live, and a future of your own choosing. The number landed between them like a stone into deep water. $50,000 and an apartment. A 2-bedroom in Bozeman, 2 blocks from the university. He had even chosen the school for her. He had been thinking about her, this man, in detail for longer than the 72 hours since the will was read. You've been planning this, she said. I have been planning for your future, honey. Yes, your grandfather did not provide for you. I have spent the last 3 months trying to figure out how to correct that on behalf of the family. I think this offer is more than generous, and I think you know it is. She looked at him. The clearing was almost dark now. The pines around them had gone black against a sky still holding the last of the day's gray. His face in that half-light was the face of a man explaining a reasonable thing to a girl who he had every confidence would be reasonable in return. Why do you want it so badly? She said. Her voice was very quiet. Want what, honey? This barn. Why does a man with a 4,000-acre ranch and a copper project and a condominium in Bozeman want a falling-down barn on 2 acres badly enough to drive out here at sundown to ask an 18-year-old girl for it in person? The smile did not change. The smile did not change at all. But something moved behind his eyes very fast, and she saw it, and she knew he knew she saw it. Because Silas left it to you for a reason that was not kind, Wren. Your grandfather was a vindictive old man at the end of his life. He left you a problem because he wanted to embarrass this family in front of you. I am trying to clean up his mess, that is all. I am trying to give you something real in exchange for what he gave you as a joke. It does not feel like a joke. He sighed. He looked down at his hands. When he looked back up, his face had reorganized itself into something gentler. Take a few days. Stay up at the inn in town. I'll cover the room. Take the weekend to think. Call Kavanaugh on Monday morning. The offer will still be there. He took his hat off again. He stepped back toward the truck. One more thing, honey, and I say this because I care about you and because I knew your mother. Do not spend the night out here alone. This barn is not safe. The roof is older than it looks, and the foundation has shifted. There have been bears moving through this valley all spring. Come into town. The inn has a room ready for you. My name is on the booking. I'll see you Monday. He climbed into the truck. He started the engine. The headlights swept across the barn, and across her face and across the open door. And then the truck turned in the clearing and rolled back down the dirt track, and the sound of the diesel faded slow into the trees and was gone. And she was alone in the dark with a cup of coffee she had not drunk and a hat that was not hers. She poured the coffee out onto the gravel. She walked back into the barn. She closed the door behind her. She slid the heavy oak bar across it that she had not seen in the daylight, a bar her grandfather had built and oiled and left ready for the night a person might need to lock the world out. She lit the lantern. She sat down on the iron cot. She sat there for a long time, and she did not cry. She had cried in front of Buck Renfro, and she had cried over her grandfather's letter, and she was finished crying for the day. There was a small, flat, hard place inside her chest now that had not been there that morning, and she sat with it, and she let it settle, and she let it become her own. He had killed her mother. He had sat in her grandfather's kitchen 16 years ago and threatened to kill her. And tonight, he had brought her a thermos of coffee. She knew without being able to prove it that the coffee in that cup had not been only coffee. She slept on the cot with the bar across the door and the iron key under the pillow and the letter inside her jacket against her ribs, and she did not dream. She woke at first light. The barn was very cold. Gray dawn came through the cracks in the cedar walls in long, thin bars. She sat up on the cot, and she looked around the great interior of the barn in the new light, and she understood for the first time what she was looking at. Her grandfather had lived here. He had not just slept here. He had worked here. He had kept things here. The tools on the wall above the workbench were not decorative. The cot was placed exactly where the morning light through the eastern wall would fall on a man's face and wake him. The Bible on the crate had been read. He had been doing something in this barn. He had been doing something deliberate, and he had been doing it long enough that he had set up a home around it, and somewhere in this building he had left her what she needed to finish what he had started. She started searching. She started with the workbench. She lifted the tools off the pegs one by one. She felt along the underside of the bench. She pulled out the small drawer beneath it and emptied it onto the bench top. 3 pencils, a roll of twine, a folded square of fine sandpaper, a small brass key that did not match any lock she could see. She set the brass key aside. She searched the stalls. She pulled the canvas tarps off the farm implements one by one. An old plow with a chipped blade, a seed drill from another century, a hand-cranked sharpening wheel, nothing inside them, nothing under them. She climbed the stairs to the hayloft. The loft was empty, a clean, wide-board floor and a single small window in the gable end, and the pigeons that had once lived in the rafters long since gone. Nothing. She came back down. She stood in the middle of the floor and turned slow in a circle. Her eyes went back to the cot. She walked to it. She lifted the wool blanket off. She lifted the pillow. The cot frame was iron and the springs were rusted, and the thin mattress lay on top of the springs without anything between. She pulled the mattress off. There, in the metal frame of the cot, where a man would have to lift the mattress to see it, a small leather pouch had been tied to the underside of the head end with a length of waxed twine. She untied it. She opened it. Inside was a single brass key larger than the one she had found in the workbench drawer. A tag tied to it read, in her grandfather's spidery hand, "Floorboard under the bench." She knelt beside the workbench. She ran her hand along the floor at the base of it. The third board from the wall was loose. She pried it up with the chisel. Beneath it was a cavity hollowed out of the packed earth lined with cedar, and inside the cavity was an iron strong box the size of a large book. The strong box was locked. The brass key fit. She lifted the lid. Inside was a leather-bound notebook worn soft, the cover marked with the burn of an old branding iron she did not recognize. Beneath the notebook were 2 manila envelopes. Beneath the envelopes was a thick wad of cash held with a rubber band. She did not count the cash. She lifted out the notebook. The first page in her grandfather's hand said simply, "For Wren." She sat down on the floor of the barn with her back against the workbench, and she opened the notebook and she began to read. It was a journal. It was the journal of a man who had been keeping watch on something for a very long time. The first entry was dated November 16th, 2010, 2 days after her mother died. The entry said, "Only Iris is dead. Garrett did it. I do not know how I will live with this, and I do not know how I will stop him, and I do not know what I will do about the child. The child will outlive me. I have to think about the child." She turned the page. The entries were not continuous. There were weeks between some, months between others. But across the years, a pattern began to emerge. Her grandfather had been collecting. He had been collecting names and dates and amounts of money and the addresses of land parcels her aunt's husband had bought through one shell company after another. He had been writing down what he heard at family dinners, what he overheard in his own house when Garrett Thorne thought he was alone in a study. The names of state regulators who showed up at the ranch on weekends. The names of a county commissioner who had voted 3 times in 5 years for variances on copper extraction in protected watersheds, and the dates on which her grandfather had personally watched envelopes change hands. It was a record. It was a quiet, meticulous 15-year record kept by an old man in a barn while he waited for a granddaughter he was not allowed to know to grow up. She turned to the last entry. It was dated 3 weeks before he died. "Doc tells me my time is short. The thing in my lung has spread. I am going to mail this letter to him next week, and I am going to ask him to give it to Wren when she is old enough. I am out of time to do anything more myself. I have set the table. She will sit at it, or she will not. God help her either way, and God forgive me for putting it on her. She closed the notebook. She held it in both hands for a long moment. Then she opened the manila envelopes. The first envelope contained a geological survey. It was bound and stamped by an engineering firm out of Spokane. It was 60 pages long. She did not understand all of it. She understood enough. The Whitefish Valley Copper Initiative, as proposed and permitted, would discharge cyanide and arsenic into the upper aquifer at concentrations that would render the water of 14 named ranches unsafe for human or livestock consumption within 40 months of operations beginning, and would remain unsafe by the report's most conservative projection for approximately 350 years. The names of the 14 ranches were listed on the final page. She read them: the Henning Place, the Briar Creek operation, the Larkins, the McRaes, the Calloway brothers, the Sutton Ranch. 14 families. Some of them had owned that land since before Montana was a state. The second envelope contained a list. 53 names: state senators, county commissioners, a regional administrator of the Bureau of Land Management, a judge in Kalispell. Each name had a dollar amount beside it. Each dollar amount had a date. Each date had the name of one of Garrett Thorne's shell companies attached, and the account number from which the wire transfer had been initiated. Her grandfather had not just been watching, he had been recording. He had been recording for 15 years. She sat against the workbench in the slowly brightening light of the barn, and she understood, finally, what Silas Halloway had done. He had not been able to fight Garrett Thorne with the law because the law in this part of the state had been bought. He had not been able to fight him in court because he had no court to go to. He had spent 15 years building a weapon out of patience, and he had hidden the weapon in a barn that he had bought decades before with money no one knew about, and he had left the weapon to a granddaughter he had bet the rest of his life on the courage of. $30,000? $50,000? A condominium in Bozeman. He had known what they would offer her. He had set the price for her soul out in front of her, so she would be able to see when she said no exactly what she was saying no to. She put the notebook and the envelopes back into the strongbox. She put the cash on top. She closed the lid. She slid the box back into the cavity and laid the floorboard over it and pressed it flat with her boot. She sat on the cot for a moment with her hands on her knees. Then she stood up. She picked up the lantern. She put the iron key in her pocket. She lifted the oak bar off the door. She walked out into the clear, cold morning, and she set off down the dirt track on foot toward Cedar Hollow, because there was a man in town she needed to talk to, and she could no longer afford to wait. She found Buck Renfro already at the hardware store. He was sweeping the front step with a corn bristle broom. He stopped when he saw her coming up the road. He set the broom against the wall. He did not say anything. He held the door open and she walked past him into the warm smell of cedar
and machine oil, and he followed her in and closed the door behind them. "You read it," he said. "I read it. All of it. All of it." He nodded. He went behind the counter. He put the coffee on. They did not speak for several minutes. He brought her a cup. He brought himself a cup. They sat across from each other beside the wood stove the way they had sat the day before. "He told me," Buck said finally. "Not all of it, not what was in the notebook, but he told me he was keeping one. He told me where it was. He told me that if you ever came to me asking about it, I was to drive you wherever you needed to go and stand between you and any door you needed to walk through. And I was not to argue with you about any of it because the choice was yours." She looked at him. "You knew." "I knew the shape of it, not the details. Silas was a careful man with what he carried. He carried the most of it alone. You should have told someone." "Wren." His voice was very low. 12 years ago, I drove into Kalispell to a federal building, and I sat down across a desk from a man who carried a badge, and I told him everything I knew. 3 weeks later, my barn burned to the ground. 40 head of cattle in it. My wife of 41 years was in the upstairs apartment over the tack room when it went. She got out. She got out with second-degree burns on both arms. The fire was ruled accidental. The investigator's name is on a list in your grandfather's strongbox. I imagine you saw it." She closed her eyes. "I am sorry," she said. "I am not telling you for sympathy, child. I am telling you so you understand. There is no one I could tell who was not already bought. There is no one in this valley who has tried to stop them who has not paid for it. Your grandfather understood that better than any of us. He did not write the notebook because he thought he could send it to the sheriff. He wrote it so that one day the right person in the right moment could send it somewhere the buying did not reach. And he thought I was that person. He hoped you were." She drank her coffee. She set the cup down. "I need to know about my mother." Buck Renfro looked at her a long time. "I will tell you what I know. It is not much more than what is in the letter." "Tell me anyway," he told her. He told her about Iris Halloway as a young woman brilliant and stubborn and brave. He told her about the night Iris had come down to the hardware store 2 weeks before she died and asked Buck to hold a manila envelope for her in his safe and not open it unless something happened to her. He told her how he had given the envelope back to Silas after Iris died, and Silas had buried it in the strongbox in the floor of the barn, and Buck had never seen it again. He told her about the funeral. He told her about her father, John Halloway, a good man broken by a grief he could not survive, who had been her father for 2 years, and then a ghost in a series of motels for the 11 years it had taken him to drink himself into a Spokane hotel room and not come out. He told her about the Methodist church at the end of the road where Silas had gone every Sunday morning of the last 15 years of his life and sat in the back pew alone and prayed for forgiveness
for a thing Buck did not know the shape of. He told her there was something else.
"The pastor at the church,"
Buck said.
"Pastor Whitaker. He is an old man, older than me. Your grandfather was close with him. The week before Silas went into hospice, he asked Whitaker to keep something for you. Whitaker has been waiting to see if you would come. You will need to go there. You will need to go there today." She stood up. "Wren." She looked at him. "You do not have to do any of this. The man offered you $50,000. There is no shame in taking the money and walking away from a fight you did not start. Your grandfather would not have blamed you for it. I would not blame you for it. You are 18 years old. You have done nothing in your life to deserve being asked to carry this."
"I know," she said. She set her empty cup on the counter. "I am going to the church." The Methodist church was small and white and very old. The doors were unlocked. She walked into the dim narthex and into a sanctuary of 12 wooden pews and a small altar and tall, narrow windows of clear glass through which the morning light came in pale and clean. A man was kneeling at the front of the church with his back to her, his head bowed, his hands folded on the rail. He must have heard her come in. He did not turn. He finished his prayer. He crossed himself in the slow, careful way of an old Methodist who had picked up the habit late in life. Then he stood and turned, and his face, when he saw her, went still in the way she was beginning to recognize. The way the faces of old men went still when they saw her grandfather's daughter's daughter walk into a room.
"Iris's child,"
he said.
"Yes, I am Pastor Whitaker. Your grandfather was my friend."
He came down the aisle toward her. He was very thin and stooped, with white hair and a face like a kind hawk. He took her hand in both of his and held it. His hands were dry and cool. "He told me about you. He told me what he had done and why he had done it. I have not always agreed with the choices he made, but I never doubted his love for you. Not for one day, child. Not for one day." He led her to the back of the sanctuary and into a small office off the side hallway. He moved with the slow steadiness of a man whose joints no longer hurried for anyone. He sat down at a wooden desk. He unlocked the bottom drawer with a key from his pocket. He took out a flat metal box. "He brought this here in early January," he said. 2 weeks before he went into hospice. He asked me to give it to you if you came. He said you would come." He set the box on the desk between them. He slid it toward her. "He told me to tell you one thing when I gave it to you. He said you do not have to open it today. You can take it home and sit with it. You can put it away for a year. He said the only thing he asked is that you do not open it angry. He said anger will read it wrong." She set her hand on the box. "Thank you, Pastor." "Sit a while if you want, child. There is no one here today. The light is good." She sat for a long time in the back pew of the empty sanctuary, with the flat metal box in her lap and the cold light coming in through the tall windows. She did not open the box there. She did not feel ready. She held it on her knees the way a person holds the hand of someone she loves and does not yet know how to say goodbye to. After a while, she took the box and walked back to the barn. She opened it in the lantern light, sitting on the iron cot with her back against the wall. The box was full of photographs. There were hundreds. Some were old. The colors faded to amber and rose, the edges worn soft. Some were recent. Some were Polaroids. Some were prints from a drugstore. They were arranged in no particular order. She lifted them out and laid them on the blanket beside her one by one. A photograph of a small girl of 3 or 4 in a faded yellow dress standing on the front porch of a brown house, holding a plastic doll, looking down at her own scuffed shoes. The angle of the photograph was from across the street. The little girl had not known she was being photographed. The little girl was her. A photograph of an 8-year-old in a winter coat, too large for her, walking out of a brick elementary school, with a backpack on her shoulders, surrounded by other children lost in the crowd. Taken from the parking lot. The angle low, as if from the driver's seat of a car. A photograph of a 13-year-old standing in the bleachers of a school gymnasium in a row of other children in white shirts, holding a stiff paper certificate. An 8th grade graduation. Taken from the very last row of the audience, the focus a little soft, the way a man's hand might shake when he was taking a picture he should not have been taking. A photograph of a 15-year-old at the bus stop on a winter morning breath, visible hair tucked into the collar of a coat. The angle from across the street. A photograph of a 17-year-old in a fast food uniform behind the counter of a diner, taken through the front window from the parking lot. A photograph of a girl, 18 years old, walking out of the state group home in Great Falls yesterday morning with a cardboard box under her arm. There was a small leather notebook in the bottom of the box. She opened it. Inside, in her grandfather's spidery hand, was a list. The list was 16 years long. Every entry was a date. Every date had a single line of text beside it. April 11th, 2010. She took her first steps today. I watched from the truck across the lot at the daycare. I cried like a child. September 4th, 2013. First day of kindergarten. She wore a red coat. She did not cry. I cried for her.
December 25th, 2016. She was placed with the Hendricks family for the holiday. I drove past the house at noon. I saw her at the front window. She did not see me. There were entries for every birthday, every first day of school, every Christmas, every Easter. There were entries for days she would not have remembered being noticed. The day she fell off her bike in the 3rd grade? The day her library book bag broke in the rain in the 6th grade? The day she had stood at her mother's grave at 12 years old for the first and only time the state had let her go. September 17th, 2020. She visited Iris today. The Hendricks family drove her. She stood at the grave for 19 minutes. She did not cry. She put a single yellow flower on the headstone. I was 3 rows back behind the maple. I did not breathe until she was in the car. She turned page after page after page. He had been there. He had been there every birthday. He had been there at her graduation. He had stood across the street at the bus stop on 1,000 winter mornings. He had not been allowed to know her. He had not been allowed to speak to her. He had not been allowed to put his hand on her shoulder one single time in 16 years. And he had been there. He had been there for all of it. She closed the notebook. She set it on the blanket beside the photographs. She pressed both hands against her mouth, and she sat that way for a long time without moving. And the lantern on the workbench burned low, and the great quiet barn held her in its dark like a hand. When she could move again, when she could breathe again, she stood up. She walked to the workbench. She put the photographs and the notebook back into the metal box. She put the box on the workbench beside the lantern. She lifted the floorboard. She took out the strong box. She set it next to the metal box of photographs. She stood for a long moment looking at the 2 boxes side by side. The dead grandfather she had never been allowed to meet. The poison her aunt's husband was about to put into the water of 14 families. The $50,000 and the condo in Bozeman. The 72-hour clock that was now running out. She picked up the iron key. She put it in her pocket. She blew out the lantern. She walked out of the barn and barred the door behind her, and she walked the mile back to Cedar Hollow in the long afternoon light with the iron key in her pocket and a new hard quiet in her chest. She found Buck where she had left him behind the counter of the hardware store working on the books with a pencil and a paper ledger. He looked up when the bell rang. "I need to use your phone," she said. He pushed the black rotary phone on the counter toward her. She dialed the number on the back of Doc Kavanaugh's card. He answered on the second ring. "It is Wren," she said. "Yes, Miss Halloway." "I am not taking his offer." A long pause on the other end of the line. When Doc Kavanaugh spoke, his voice was very quiet. "I see." "I have the notebook. I have the survey. I have the list. I have everything he was building. I do not know what to do with it. I need help to know what to do with it. But I am not signing the barn over to that man, and I am not taking his money." Another pause. "Can you come to Missoula tomorrow morning?" "Yes." "I will arrange the meeting. There is a man I have known for 30 years. He works in the federal building. He is not a man your aunt's husband can buy. I will not say more on this line." "Tomorrow morning?" "Yes." "Doc, Yes. Thank you. The line went quiet a moment. Your grandfather, he said. Your grandfather would be very proud of you, child. I am going to say that once and not say it again because he is not here to say it himself, and you deserve to hear it said out loud one time. She hung up the phone. She stood for a moment with her hand still resting on the receiver. Buck Renfrew was watching her from across the counter. His face was the patient, watchful face of an old man who had been waiting 50 years to see someone do what was about to be done. You will not stay at his inn, he said. You will stay at my house. My wife will make up the spare room. I will drive you to Missoula in the morning. Buck, do not argue with me, child. He sent that thermos, and I do not believe he sent it empty. You will stay where I can see the door. She did not argue with him. She slept that night in a small upstairs bedroom in the Renfrew house. The room had flowered wallpaper and a quilt made by Buck's wife 40 years before, and a window that looked out onto the dark line of the mountains. Mrs. Renfrew brought her a glass of milk and a piece of buttered toast at bedtime, and did not ask her any questions, and did not make her speak. She lay in the bed and watched the moon move across the wallpaper, and she did not sleep for a long time. In the morning, Buck drove her to Missoula in his truck, the strong box, and the metal box of photographs wrapped in a piece of canvas in the bed of the pickup, covered with a tarp and weighted with a coil of barbed wire. They did not speak much on the drive. The mountains opened out around them. The light came in long and clear through the windshield. Doc Kavanaugh met them on the 3rd floor of the federal building. He took her into a small, windowless conference room. There was a man waiting at the table. He was perhaps 50 square-jawed, with hair going gray at the temples, and a charcoal suit that fit him the way a uniform fits a soldier. He stood when she came in. Miss Halloway, my name is Owen Whitlock. I am with the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Montana, working out of the Helena Field Office. I am here today as a personal favor to Merritt Kavanaugh. Anything you say in this room is between the 4 of us. I would like to hear what you have. She set the strong box on the table. She opened it. She put the notebook in front of him. She put the survey in front of him. She put the list in front of him. She did not speak. She let him read. He read for 40 minutes without speaking. He read the way a man reads who has been looking for a particular thing for a particular number of years and has just been handed it. When he finished, he closed the notebook. He laid his hand flat on top of it. He looked up at her. Miss Halloway, he said. His voice was very steady. I have been looking for evidence sufficient to open a federal case against Garrett Thorne for 9 years. I have had a file on him since 2017. My office has been blocked at 3 separate junctures by judicial intervention in this state. We have never been able to get past discovery. This notebook, if its provenance can be authenticated, is sufficient. This list, if it can be corroborated, is more than sufficient.
This survey alone is a federal environmental violation.
He paused. I need to ask you something difficult. Ask. If we open this case, your aunt's husband is going to know within 48 hours that the evidence came from you. He is going to know it because there is no other person living who could have produced this material. He is going to be charged within 90 days. He is going to be arraigned. He is going to make bail. Between the arraignment and the trial, you are going to be the most exposed witness in the state of Montana. Do you understand what that means? She thought of her mother on a road in early snow. She thought of second headlights. I understand. I can offer you witness protection. I cannot guarantee anything about your life if you accept it. I can guarantee almost nothing about your life if you refuse it. I want you to take a day to think about this. I want you to sleep on it. I want you to come back here tomorrow morning and tell me what you have decided. I will hold this evidence in a federal safe until then, and no one outside this room will know it exists. Will you do that for me? She did not need a day. She did not need an hour. But she nodded because she could see in his face that he needed her to think she had thought about it. I will come back tomorrow morning. She drove back to Cedar Hollow with Buck in the long quiet of the afternoon. Neither of them spoke much. The mountains went by. The sun set behind the Whitefish Range, and the cab filled with the cold blue light of evening, and the truck climbed the last grade into town in the last of the day, and Buck pulled into the gravel lot of the hardware store and put the truck in park. They sat for a moment with the engine running. I am going to sleep at the barn tonight, she said. No. Buck. No, child, not tonight. It is my barn. He has not won anything. I am not going to act like he has. Buck looked at her a long time in the dim cab. Then he sighed. He turned off the engine. All right, Wren Halloway, but I am driving you out there, and I am sleeping in the truck at the end of the dirt track tonight. Do not argue with me about it. That is the deal. That is the only deal there is. She did not argue. He drove her out to the barn. She got out with her box of photographs and the strongbox. He stayed in the cab at the head of the track with his rifle on the seat beside him and a thermos his wife had filled. She walked the rest of the way alone up through the dark pines, the lantern in her hand. The clearing was quiet. The barn stood in the moonlight, silver and tall, the way her grandfather had built it to stand. She unbarred the door. She went inside. She lit the lamp on the cot. She set the boxes on the workbench. She sat down on the cot with her grandfather's letter unfolded on her lap, and she read it through one more time in the small yellow light, slow the way you read a letter from a man you have just begun to know. She fell asleep with the letter on her chest. She woke to the smell of smoke. It was the wrong smell. It was not the smell of wood stove smoke or cook fire smoke. It was sharp and chemical and wrong. She sat up on the cot. The barn was dark. The lantern had burned out hours before. She could see a flicker of orange along the bottom edge of the door, low to the ground, the moving light of fire on the other side of the wood. She heard a vehicle. Not Buck's truck. Something else. Something pulling away fast down the dirt track. She did not stop to think. She grabbed the strong box off the workbench. She grabbed the metal box of photographs. She shoved the iron key in her pocket. She ran for the door, unbarred it, and threw it open. Flames were eating up the right side of the barn. Whoever had come had splashed accelerant along the cedar wall and set it and run. The fire was climbing fast. It was already at the eaves. In 10 minutes, it would be in the rafters, and the whole 100-year-old structure would be a column of fire visible from the highway. She ran. She ran across the clearing with both boxes under her arms and the smoke rolling out of the doorway behind her. She heard Buck's truck door slam at the head of the track. She heard him running up through the pines. She made the edge of the clearing and dropped to one knee and set the boxes down on the dirt, and she turned and she watched the barn burn. Buck came up beside her, breathing hard, the rifle in his hand. He took in the scene in one look. He did not waste a word.
"Get the boxes in the truck," he said. "Get in the truck. Stay down."
Buck.
"Go, child. Go now."
She picked up the boxes. She did what he told her. She ran down the dark track to the truck and threw the boxes in the cab and climbed in after them and locked the doors and slid down in the seat with her heart hammering against her ribs. From the cab, she could see the orange light of the fire climbing higher into the trees. She could see Buck's silhouette at the head of the track with the rifle held across his chest, watching the road in case whoever had set the fire decided to come back to see how it had gone. No one came back. She watched her grandfather's barn burn. She watched the fire take the cedar walls. She watched the roof catch. She watched the great 100-year-old structure her grandfather had loved enough to live in for the last months of his life shudder and lean and collapse inward on itself in a roar of sparks that climbed 300 feet into the cold Montana sky. The strong box was on the seat beside her. The metal box of photographs was on the floor between her feet. Her grandfather's letter was inside her jacket against her ribs. She did not cry. She sat in the cab of Buck Renfrow's truck and watched her barn burn, and she made a sound that was not quite a word, low and small in her throat, that no one would ever hear but her and the hard, flat, quiet place in her chest grew a little larger and a little harder, and somewhere inside that quiet, a thing was being born that she did not yet have a name for. She knew one thing. She would be in Owen Whitlock's office in the federal building in Missoula at 9 o'clock the next morning, and she would be saying yes. The fire burned down to a heap of red coals an hour before dawn. Wren sat in the cab of Buck Renfrow's truck and watched the great cedar bones of the barn glow against the dark and slowly fade. The walls were gone. The roof was gone. The fieldstone foundation stood alone at the center of the clearing, like the foundation of a small church after a war. The smoke went up in a thin gray column and bent eastward on the high wind and disappeared into the lightening sky. Buck did not speak for a long time. He stood at the head of the dirt track with the rifle held in the crook of his arm, and his hat pulled low, and his old face set in the patient, grim arrangement of a man who had seen fires before and had buried what came after. When the first gray of true dawn came up over the ridge, he turned and walked to the truck and opened the driver's door and climbed in.
"Volunteer fire is on the way," he said. "I called from the radio. It is too late for anything but the count."
"We will let them count." "Buck." "Hush, child." He put the truck in gear. He drove down the track and out onto the county road. The fire trucks passed them coming the other way, 2 pumpers and an old tanker, the lights flashing weak and red across the pale pines. The driver of the lead truck lifted one hand off the wheel as they passed. Buck lifted one hand off his. They drove into town. The diner was just opening. A few lights were on in the houses along the side street. The wind smelled like ash now, even down here, the whole valley carrying the smell of her grandfather's barn into the morning. Buck pulled into the gravel lot of his hardware store. He did not get out. He sat with his hands on the wheel.
"You are going to Missoula,"
he said.
"I am going to Missoula. You are going to tell that man yes. I am going to tell that man yes."
He nodded once slow. He looked out through the windshield at the small bright window of the diner across the road.
"Mrs. Renfro has breakfast going,"
he said.
"You will eat before we leave. You will eat eggs. You will eat them whether you want to or not, because the day you have ahead of you is not a day to start on an empty stomach. Then we will get in the truck and we will drive."
She did not argue. She ate the eggs. Mrs. Renfro set them down without a word and did not watch her eat them and did not ask her how she had slept. She ate 3 eggs and 2 pieces of toast and drank a cup of black coffee. And when she stood up from the table, her hands had stopped trembling and the hard, flat place in her chest had cooled into something she could carry. Buck drove her to Missoula. The strong box rode on the seat between them. The metal box of photographs rode on the floor between her feet. They did not speak until they were on the long descent out of the high country into the valley, and then Buck cleared his throat and said only, "I called Doc. He is meeting us at the building. He will not leave that room while you are in it. I want you to know that." "I know." "He loved your grandfather, Wren. He loved your grandfather the way men of our age loved each other and never said it out loud. He is going to stand at your shoulder today, whether you want him there or not, so you might as well want him. I want him." Buck looked at her sideways. Something almost like a smile moved through the corners of his old mouth and was gone. "Good," he said. Owen Whitlock was already in the conference room when they arrived. He stood when she came in. Doc Kavanaugh was beside him at the table with his hands folded on the leather notebook. Whitlock saw her face. He saw Buck behind her.
He looked once at the smear of soot on the cuff of her jacket and the smell of smoke that came in with her, and his jaw set. "What happened?" "Someone burned the barn last night," she said. "I was inside it. I got out. The evidence is here."
Whitlock looked at her a long moment.
"You said yes."
"I said yes." He pulled out a chair for her. She sat. The next 3 hours were the longest of her life, and they passed faster than any 3 hours she had ever lived. Whitlock asked questions. She answered. Doc Kavanaugh took notes. A second federal attorney came in midway through a younger woman named Calliope Bross, with steel gray eyes and a calm she had clearly built one brick at a time over a long career, who introduced herself and shook Wren's hand and sat down and did not speak again for an hour, but missed nothing. Whitlock walked her through the notebook page by page. He walked her through the survey. He walked her through the list of 53 names. He stopped on the 11th name on the list.
"This man," he said. "This is the regional administrator for the Bureau of Land Management out of Billings. The wire transfer your grandfather records here is dated June of 2019. Do you know how your grandfather came to have the account number this transfer originated from?" "No." "Your grandfather had a man inside one of the shell corporations." He looked at her steadily.
"Whoever that man was, he was risking his life. Your grandfather wrote down what that man gave him for 15 years. We are going to spend the next 6 months finding out who he was and whether he is still alive. If he is alive, this case becomes very different. If he is dead, this notebook is still the most thoroughly documented case of state-level political corruption my office has seen in 20 years of practice." She nodded.
"Tomorrow morning, we file the affidavit," Whitlock said. "Tomorrow afternoon, I begin the work of getting a federal warrant against Garrett Thorne. By the end of next week, I expect to be in front of a grand jury. Between today and the day of his arrest, you do not go anywhere alone. You do not stay anywhere your aunt or her husband can find you. You do not take phone calls from numbers you do not recognize. You do not eat food that was not prepared by someone in this room or by Mrs. Renfro. Is that clear?"
"That is clear."
"There is one more thing I have to say to you, Miss Halloway, and I am saying it not as a federal prosecutor, but as a man who has done this work for 23 years and has buried 2 witnesses. Your grandfather built this case for you, and he asked you to carry it across a finish line that he did not live to cross. He did not ask you because he wanted to put you in danger. He asked you because there was no one else. I am going to put the full weight of this office behind you. I am going to put United States Marshals on your door if you will let me. But the danger does not end with the arrest. It does not end with the trial. The people on this list are going to lose careers and houses and pensions. Some of them are going to lose marriages. None of them are going to forgive you for it. You are 18 years old. I want you to know what you have agreed to."
She looked at him across the table. "My mother was 30 years old when she died," she said.
Her voice was very quiet and very steady. She knew what she had agreed to. They killed her for it anyway. I am 18 years old, and I am going to do what she did not get to finish. That is what I have agreed to. The room was very quiet.
Calliope Bross set down her pen. She looked at Wren for a long moment, and then she nodded once slow, and that small gesture from a stranger across a federal conference table was somehow the first thing all morning that almost broke her. She did not break. They drove back to Cedar Hollow in the afternoon. Buck did not take her to the burnt-out clearing. He took her to his house. Mrs. Renfro had moved her things into the spare room. There was a small cedar box on the dresser that Buck had built himself the week before, with a brass clasp and a tight lid. Mrs. Renfro had lined the inside with green felt. The strong box went into it. The metal box of photographs went on the nightstand by the bed. She slept for 14 hours. She did not dream. Garrett Thorne came to Cedar Hollow on the third day. He came alone in the same dark gray crew cab, and he parked it in front of the diner at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Wren was in the diner when he came in. She was sitting in a booth in the back with a cup of coffee and a copy of the local paper. Buck was on a stool at the counter 20 feet away. Della Monroe, who ran the diner, was wiping the same patch of counter she had been wiping for 10 minutes. Garrett came in with his hat in his hand. He took off the hat. He looked around the diner and saw her in the back. He smiled. The smile was the same smile from the clearing. He walked the length of the diner, slow the way a man walks who wants you to see him coming. He stopped beside her booth. "May I?" "Sit." He sat. He laid his hat on the bench beside him. He looked at her steadily. "I heard about the barn. I am very sorry, honey. I told you the place was not safe. I had no idea it was that bad. I drove down as soon as I heard. I wanted to see you in person." "That is kind of you. I want to revise my offer." She looked at him. "My aunt is going to outlive you by 10 years, and you and I both know it," she said. "She is the one who runs your house. She is the one who has been running it for 20 years. I am not negotiating with you, Garrett. I am not negotiating with her either. I am not signing anything. Not for $50,000, and not for $2 million, and not for any number you can write on a check. You can go back to Whitefish, and you can tell her I said so." The smile did not move. The smile did not move at all. $2 million. I said no. $2 million, cash Wren by Friday. Free and clear. You walk away from all of this. You go to school. You buy a house. You never see any of us again. $2 million. No. He looked at her for a long moment. The smile faded slowly the way a light goes down on a stage. What was left underneath was not anger. It was nothing. It was a face she had not seen yet. A face she understood
at once was the face her mother had seen on a mountain road 16 years before.
You do not know what you are doing, honey. I know exactly what I am doing. You think you do?
Garrett, I am holding the notebook. I am holding the survey. I am holding the list of 53 names. I am holding it in a federal building in Missoula, and I have been holding it for 48 hours. By the end of next week, you will be in handcuffs in your own driveway. You can drive back to my aunt right now, and you can tell her every word I just said, and you can tell her I knew about the second headlights, and you can tell her that the granddaughter she let her husband threaten in her grandfather's kitchen 16 years ago grew up anyway. You can tell her that for me. She did not raise her voice. She did not lean forward. She drank her coffee. He sat across from her without moving. The thing that had come into his face when she said the words second headlights had not left it. He looked at her the way a man looks at a stranger. He has just realized he is going to have to kill and across the diner. Buck Renfrow set down his coffee cup very softly and turned a quarter turn on his stool, and Della Monroe stopped wiping the counter, and the whole small room held its breath. Garrett Thorne picked up his hat. He stood.
Miss Holloway. Mr. Thorne?
He walked out of the diner. He did not look back. The bell over the door chimed when it closed behind him. They heard his truck start. They heard it pull away. Buck came over and sat down across from her in the booth. Della brought the coffee pot and refilled her cup without being asked.
Child,
Buck said. His voice was very low. I have never in my life been more proud of a person sitting across a table from me than I am of you in this moment. I am going to say that once, and I am going to stop. She set down the cup. She found that her hand was steady. Thank you, Buck. He nodded. He went back to his stool. Della went back to her counter. Wren went back to her newspaper. Outside, somewhere down the county road, the first long warning of what was coming began to move. The federal warrant came down on a Thursday. Garrett Thorne was arrested at 6 a.m. on the front steps of the great log house at Holloway Ridge by a team of 4 U.S. Marshals and 2 FBI agents from the Helena field office. He came out of the house in a bathrobe and slippers. He did not resist. He asked if he could put on shoes. They let him put on shoes. They put him in the back of a black SUV and they drove him to Missoula. Celeste Holloway Thorne was not at the house when they came. She had left 2 days before. She had told the housekeeper she was going to a spa retreat in Sedona. The Sedona resort had no record of her reservation. Her passport was missing from the safe in the master bedroom. Her car was found 3 days later in long-term parking at the Calgary airport. By the time the federal indictment was unsealed, Celeste was in Belize. It took them 6 weeks to extradite her. The negotiations went through 3 federal agencies and the Office of the Secretary of State. Wren watched the news at the Renfrew kitchen table with Buck and Mrs. Renfrew on a Sunday evening in late May, and the screen showed her aunt being walked off a small jet at Bozeman in handcuffs. Her hair pulled back, no makeup, the cold, tight face of a woman who had been planning to drink wine on a beach for the rest of her life and had been told no. She watched her aunt walk down the steps of the plane. She watched the marshals put her in a car. She turned off the television. She went outside and stood on the porch of the Renfrew house and looked up at the mountains in the long blue light. And she said quietly into the air, the way her grandfather might have said it, "We are not done." The trial took 11 months to come. Through that summer and into the fall and through the long Montana winter, she lived at the Renfrew house. Mrs. Renfrew taught her to cook. Buck taught her to keep books and to order inventory and to handle the small black ledger that ran his hardware store. She worked at the store 6 days a week. She made a small wage. She put it in a checking account at the Cedar Hollow First National. Doc Kavanaugh drove down from Missoula every other Sunday, and they sat at the kitchen table together and went over what she would say if asked the things she would be asked at trial. She did not see the federal prosecutors except at scheduled meetings. She did not see her aunt at all. She did not see her aunt's husband except in the photographs the newspaper kept reprinting of the morning he was led down off the courthouse steps in his bathrobe and slippers. The men who had paid Garrett Thorne began to fall in the autumn. The county commissioner in Kalispell resigned in October. The judge resigned in November and was indicted on tax fraud in February. The regional administrator for the Bureau of Land Management was arrested on a Tuesday morning in December at his home in Billings. 3 state senators announced they would not seek re-election. The Whitefish Valley Copper Initiative was canceled by the parent corporation in January, citing what the press release called unforeseen regulatory complications. 14 ranches in the Upper Valley sent letters of thanks to the Cedar Hollow Methodist Church, addressed to no one in particular, and Pastor Whitaker read every letter aloud from the pulpit one Sunday morning in March, while Wren sat in the back pew and looked at her hands. The trial began on a Monday morning in May. She testified on the 3rd day. She wore a dark green dress that Mrs. Renfrew had bought for her. She wore her hair pulled back. She walked into the federal courtroom in Missoula with Doc Kavanaugh at her left shoulder and Buck Renfrew at her right, and she sat down in the witness box, and she put her hand on the Bible. The bailiff held out to her, and she swore the oath. Her voice did not shake. Calliope Bross stood up at the prosecution table. She walked to the front of the witness box. She held the leather-bound notebook in one hand. "Miss Halloway, do you recognize this book?" "I do. Will you describe it for the court?" "It is the journal of my grandfather, Silas Halloway. He kept it for 15 years. It contains the record of his observations of the activities of Garrett Thorne and the corporate entities Garrett Thorne controlled, beginning in November of 2010 and ending 3 weeks before my grandfather's death in January of this year." "And how did you come to possess this journal?" "Yes, my grandfather left it for me.
He left it in a hidden cavity beneath a workbench in the barn he willed to me on the occasion of my 18th birthday. For the record, Miss Halloway, why did your grandfather will you that barn?" She looked across the courtroom.
Garrett Thorne was at the defense table in a charcoal suit with his hair combed back. He was looking at her steadily. Beside him, 2 seats down, Celeste sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her. She had not looked at Wren once in the 3 days of the trial. She did not look at her now. Wren looked at the 2 of them. She looked at the jury. She looked back at Calliope Bross. "My grandfather willed me that barn," she said, "because he could not protect me inside our family for 16 years, and because that barn was the only piece of clean ground he had left to give me. He left me $10 to pay for it, because he wanted me to understand that what he was giving me would cost almost nothing in money and almost everything in courage. He left me a letter explaining why my mother had been murdered and by whom. He left me the journal you are holding because he had spent 15 years building a record that he could not deliver to a court himself, and because he hoped that when I was old enough, I would deliver it for him. That is why he willed me that barn." The courtroom was very quiet. Garrett Thorne's lawyer rose for cross-examination. He was a careful man from a careful firm in Denver, with gray hair and small, precise hands. He asked her about her mother. He asked her about her father. He asked her about the years in foster care. He asked her in a gentle voice, with great civility, whether she had not in fact been a vulnerable and angry young woman, primed by 16 years of state custody to believe a posthumous story told to her by a man she had never met. She answered him steadily. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She did not give him a single sentence he could break apart in his closing argument. When he sat down 2 hours later, Calliope Bross asked her one final question on redirect. "Miss Halloway, if you had taken the $50,000 and the condominium in Bozeman that Garrett Thorne offered you on the evening of April 18th, what do you believe would have happened to the 14 ranches in the upper Whitefish Valley?" The defense objected. The judge overruled. She looked at the jury. "They would have lost their water," she said, "and their cattle, and their land, and their grandchildren's chance to ever live on it, and nobody would have ever known why." She stepped down from the witness box. She did not look at her aunt. She did not look at the man who had killed her mother. She walked the length of the federal courtroom with her grandfather's notebook closed on the rail behind her, and she walked out the door, and Buck Renfro was waiting for her in the hallway, and he did not say anything, and she did not say anything, and they walked together out of the building into the long, bright spring afternoon. Garrett Thorne was convicted on 22 federal counts in early June. He was sentenced in August to 22 years in federal prison. Celeste, who had taken a plea agreement in exchange for testimony against her husband, and 3 of the state senators, was sentenced to 18 years. The Whitefish Valley Copper Initiative parent company was fined $84 million. The 14 ranches sued for damages and won. 11 of the 53 names in the journal were ultimately prosecuted at the federal or state level. The other 42 had their careers ended in other ways. The Halloway Ridge Ranch, after the federal seizure and the long process of distribution, was deeded back to the original Halloway homestead. 812 acres along the upper bench of the Whitefish River. The original parcel that Wren's great-grandfather had broken sod on in the spring of 1908, with 2 horses and a hand plow and a wife 6 months pregnant. The deed was placed in Wren's name in October, 2 months after her 19th birthday. She did not move into the ranch house right away. She lived for another 6 months with Buck and Mrs. Renfrow. She finished the work she had taken on at the hardware store. She kept the books through the winter and into the spring. She learned slowly and patiently, and with no hurry, the long, slow work of running cattle in country that meant to kill you if you got casual about it. In April, on the morning of her 20th birthday, she packed a small canvas bag, and Buck drove her up the long county road to the ranch and dropped her off at the gate. He did not get out of the truck. "You will call if you need anything." "I will call." "You will come down for Sunday dinner." "I will come down." He nodded once. He put the truck in gear. He drove back down the road, and she watched him go until the dust settled. And then she turned and walked up the long gravel drive to the house her great-grandfather had built, and her grandfather had lived in, and her mother had been a girl in. The door was unlocked. She went inside. She lived there alone for the first year. She hired one foreman, a man named Renfrow, who was Buck's nephew. She bought a small herd of black Angus. She put the house back into the shape it had been in when her grandfather was a young man, the heavy pine furniture oiled and the floors scrubbed and the windows opened to the long spring wind. She put her mother's photograph on the mantel of the front room beside a small framed picture of Silas Halloway in his Forest Service uniform from 1967, the burn scar on his right wrist barely visible at the cuff of the sleeve. She enrolled in the Agricultural Extension Program at the University of Montana, doing the coursework by correspondence in the long, quiet evenings. She paid her own tuition out of the small monthly draw she took from the ranch. She did not touch the federal witness reward money. It sat in an account in Bozeman. She did not need it. The ranch made enough. She let the money grow. She thought sometimes of what she would eventually do with it. The barn on parcel 7B-44 was rebuilt in the second summer. She did the work herself with Buck and a small crew of men from the valley who would not take money for the labor. They came on weekends. They came after their own work was done. Some of them were the sons of men whose names had been on the list of 14 ranches in her grandfather's survey. Some of them were old enough to have known Silas when he was a young jumper out of Missoula. They cleared the burned ground. They reset the fieldstone foundation. They felled cedar from the upper slopes of her own ranch and cut it on a portable mill and stacked it to dry through the winter. And the next spring they began to raise the walls. The new barn went up in 3 weeks of long days. They built it on the same footprint as the old. They used the same hand-hewn beams in the rafters because Buck had pulled the original beams out of the rubble before they could fully burn, and the iron of them was scorched. But the cedar at the core was sound, and they planed them down and oiled them and set them back up the way Silas had set them up the first time 58 years before. When the barn was done, she did not put a lock on it. She put a wooden bar across the door on the inside, the way her grandfather had, and she left the door unbarred when she was not inside. She used it as a workshop. She had taken up carpentry in the long winter evenings slowly, the way her grandfather had laid down his journal, one careful entry at a time. She built things out of cedar, small things at first, a bookshelf for the front room of the ranch house, a bench for the front porch, then larger things, a dining table for Mrs. Renfro's kitchen to replace the table the Renfros had eaten at for 40 years, a cradle for the first grandchild born in the valley after the trial, a Henning boy whose grandfather had wept at the trial verdict, and who had carried the photograph of Silas Halloway in his wallet for 50 years. She gave the cradle to the Henning family for nothing. She did not let them pay her. She told them only that her grandfather would have wanted them to have it, and that was the end of the discussion. The cedar box she had built for the strong box sat on the mantel of the front room of the ranch house between her mother's photograph and her grandfather's. The strong box was inside it. The journal was inside the strong box. She did not open the journal often. She had read it many times. She no longer needed to read it. The leather notebook of photographs that Pastor Whitaker had given her in the small office of the Methodist Church sat in the top drawer of her grandfather's desk in the study at the ranch. She opened that one more often. She would open it on long winter nights when the wind was loud against the windows and she could not sleep. She would sit at the desk with the small green lamp burning and turn the pages slow one by one, looking at the photographs of the small girl in the yellow dress on the brown front porch, the 8-year-old in the winter coat too large for her, the 13-year-old in the school gymnasium holding her certificate, the 17-year-old behind the diner counter. She would read the entries her grandfather had made in his spidery hand. She would read about her own first steps, about her first day of kindergarten, about the yellow flower she had placed on her mother's headstone when she was 12. She would close the notebook and put it back in the drawer. She would go to bed, and she would sleep, and in the morning, the work of the ranch would be waiting for her, the way the work always waited, the way it had waited for her great-grandfather in 1908, and for her grandfather in 1962, and for her mother in 1985. The way it would wait for whoever came after her. The summer she turned 23 on a morning in late June, she rode out alone before dawn to the upper bench of the ranch where the river bent west around a stand of cottonwoods. She tied her horse at the cottonwoods and she walked up to the small fenced cemetery on the hill where 4 generations of Halloways were buried. Her great-grandparents, her great-uncle who had died in France in 1918, her grandmother who had died of cancer in 1996, her mother Iris, whose grave she had stood at one time at the age of 12, and who now lay under a stone the color of river slate, with her name and the dates, and a single line that read, "Beloved daughter, beloved mother, beloved." And in the corner of the cemetery, under a young aspen tree, the simple stone of Silas Halloway. The dates. The single line her grandfather had asked Doc Kavanaugh to have cut into the stone before he died. A good man leaveth an inheritance. She knelt beside the stone. She took from her jacket a small piece of cedar she had carved herself in the new barn the previous winter. It was the size of a man's palm. On one side, she had carved the words of Proverbs 13:22, the whole verse in the same spidery script her grandfather had used in his letters, and his journal copied as carefully as she could copy it. On the other side, she had carved a small, simple figure of a man in a Forest Service jumpsuit, a parachute opening above him, falling toward a line of trees. It was rough work. She was not a master carver yet, but the lines were true. She set the piece of cedar at the base of his stone. She did not speak for a long time. "Grandfather," she said finally, and her voice was very quiet in the high morning. "I did what you asked me to do. I did not do it the way you would have done it. I did it the way I had to do it. I think you would say that was all right." The wind moved through the aspens. "I have the ranch back. I have your barn back. I have your letter and your journal and the photographs of every birthday you stood across the street and watched. I have all of it, and I have a life of my own now too, and I do not know yet what the rest of that life is going to look like. But I know it is going to be built on what you built. And I know that what you built was honest. And I know that what you built cost you everything. And I know that I am the only one left to carry it." She paused. "I am going to carry it." She put her hand flat on the cold stone. "I love you," she said. "I never got to say it to you when you were alive. I am saying it now. I love you. Thank you for the barn. Thank you for the $10. Thank you for waiting for me on the other side of the street for 16 years. Thank you for trusting me with the rest of it." She knelt there for another long moment in the high quiet of the morning. The aspens whispered. A red-tailed hawk turned slow above the ridge. The sun came up over the eastern range and laid its first long light across the cemetery and across her grandfather's stone and across the small cedar piece at its base. She stood. She brushed off her knees. She walked back down the hill to her horse. She mounted up. She rode back across the upper bench of the ranch toward the house, the long grass moving around the horse's legs in the new light. The river loud at the bottom of the draw, and the work of the day was already waiting for her down at the corrals where her foreman would be saddling the second horse, and the cattle would be working their way down to water. And the new barn was standing in its clearing 7 miles to the south, where it would stand for another 100 years. And the old man who had built it, and the old men who had loved him, and the young woman who had finished what he started, were all of them in their proper places at last. And the long, quiet morning held them all. She thought as she rode about the $10 barn. She thought about how it had looked to her the first time she had seen it, standing alone in a clearing at the end of a dirt track on the worst day of her life. How it had looked like a punishment. How it had looked like an insult. She thought about what Buck had said to her on the night the barn had burned in the cab of his truck while the fire still roared at the head of the dirt track. He had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said very softly, almost to himself, that her grandfather had not given her a building. Her grandfather had given her a place to stand. And a place to stand, Buck had said, is the only thing in this world that is worth more than money. She had not understood him that night. She had been too tired and too afraid and too full of smoke. She understood him now. A place to stand. That was what her grandfather had given her. Not a ranch, not 800 acres, not a federal witness reward in a Bozeman account, not even the satisfaction of seeing her aunt let off a small jet in handcuffs in the long blue light of a spring evening in Montana. A place to stand. He had given her ground that was clean. He had given her ground that no one had bought. He had given her ground a person could put her feet on and say the word no and have the word mean something. He had given her the one thing his whole long life had taught him a person could not buy and could not be given by anyone who did not love her. And he had given it to her in the only form he knew how to give, which was a falling down cedar barn on 2 acres of land that he had paid for in dollars he had earned with his own hands 50 years before. She rode down the long bench of the ranch in the new sun, and she understood finally what she was carrying. She was carrying her grandfather's name. She was carrying it the way a good name is meant to be carried, which is forward. And the $10 barn, the new barn, the second barn, the barn that the men of the valley had raised with their own hands in 3 weeks of long days. The barn that stood now in its clearing south of town, with its door unbarred and its workbench clean and its iron cot still made up the way her grandfather had left it the morning he walked out of it for the last time to go into hospice. The barn would stand. It would stand for as long as cedar stands. It would stand longer than her. It would stand longer than anyone who knew or would ever know the story
of how it came to be there a second time.
And one day, a long time from now, when she was an old woman and her own grandchildren were grown, she would walk one of those grandchildren up the dirt track to the clearing, and she would unbar the door of the barn, and she would set a lantern on the workbench, and she would tell the story. She would tell it slow. She would tell it true.
She would say that once, a long time ago, in the high country of Montana, a man named Silas Halloway, who had been a smoke jumper and a father and a grandfather and a quiet keeper of a 15-year journal, had built a barn out of cedar and stone. And when he died, he had left that barn to a granddaughter he had not been allowed to know. And the price had been $10. And she had paid the $10. And she had stood her ground. And the ground had held. She would say all of that, and then she would put her hand on her grandchild's shoulder, and the two of them would stand together in the doorway of the barn and look out at the long evening light coming down over the clearing. And she would say one more thing. She would say the things that look like Burden's child, the things that look like insults, the things that look like nothing at all. Look at them again. Look at them twice. Sometimes the thing that looks like the least is the only thing worth more than everything else. And then she would close the door of the barn, and she would walk back down the dirt track in the long Montana evening, with the small hand of her grandchild in hers, and the barn would stand behind them in the clearing, and the long valley would hold them, and the work of the next morning would be waiting. It was a good life. It was the life her grandfather had bet on. It was the life her mother had died trying to make possible. It was the life she had chosen on a cold spring evening in a barn she had never seen before, when she had broken the seal on a letter from a man she had never been allowed to know, and decided that she would not take the money and she would not walk away. She had been 18 years old. She had stood her ground. She would stand it for the rest of her days